We started Carl Jung last time, and we said one way to understand any school of psychoanalysis is to understand it in terms of 7 areas. What is the philosophy of the school? What is the model of the mind? What are the core concepts of the school? And when you put model of the mind and the core concepts together, you get pathogenesis. And once you have pathogenesis of how a pathology emerges, then based upon it, you have a healing method. So 6 always is a function of 4. Healing method always will be a function of pathogenesis. If you believe disorders are created primarily out of a cognitive disorder, your healing method will be like CT or CBT. If you believe trapped feelings are the reason for pathology, your healing method will be more like emotion-centered therapy, ISTDP, or much of psychoanalysis. And based upon the concepts, the psychological tests and tools will be created. So 5 will always be a function of 3. And then how do you define healing? Do you define healing as removal of symptoms? Do you define healing as ability to be creative and playful, like Winnicott does? Or do you define healing as self-realization at the end of individuation, as Carl Jung defines it? Or are you more conservative like Freud and say removal of symptoms should be more than enough of a reason, and the second part can be knowing oneself, which can endlessly go on? So Freud has written a very good paper on this: therapy terminable and psychoanalysis terminable and interminable. At what point should you say goal has been reached and you terminate therapy? And who decides this? So there are various ways of managing this part, but each school has its different goal of therapy. So with this is true for all schools in psychoanalysis. Now let us come to Jung. The same things are true for Jung also. But so when you have to understand Jung's school, we can go into philosophy of the Jung school, model of the mind, concepts, pathogenesis, psychological tools and tests, healing method or therapy, and the goal of therapy. So one by one, we will take a look at everything in the Jungian context. So before we go, let us have a snap of Jung's personality. Some statements of his which are very famous. It gives us an idea about the man, and then we go into his concepts. One patient came and Jung said, "So you are in soup too." Meaning, I am also in a soup and you are also in a soup. We are both travelers and we are both wounded in a way. The therapist is not omnipotent, nor he pretends to be. Another patient, he said, "Thank God he went neurotic, because this allowed him a chance to be with himself and get out of that synthetic, plastic, alienated life that he was living, which is what the society forces us upon today." And Jung here says that often sickness becomes an occasion. Sickness becomes an occasion to undertake an inner journey, an inner pilgrimage. Welcome, Bhavna. Long time.
Good afternoon, sir. How are you? How are you, sir?
I'm good.
Very good afternoon, sir.
Good to see you after a long time.
Had to. Cannot miss this one, sir.
So Jung said, thank God he went neurotic, because the sickness becomes an occasion for an inner travel, which usually we don't do. And often this happens in the midlife crisis. In the age group of 42 to 45, when the midlife crisis happens, this often happens that the sickness becomes an occasion for almost an inner pilgrimage. So the sickness is not something to be universally condemned as evil, but often it can be an opportunity to set right an inner imbalance and prepare for the second innings more consciously. At some place, Jung writes, to be normal is the ideal aim of the unsuccessful. So he was not very much fascinated with the idea of normalcy defined by an average of society, and then therapy having its goal of confirming the individual to that normal. He was far more celebrative of the differences and of being on the margins than to conform to the average and converge there. With regard to his own journey, he says, when others could not see what I was seeing, they could only see a fool rushing ahead. But he says it is necessary to do it when you realize something ahead of others and not wait for the conformity or the support of others. Consensus often is an antidote to innovation. And lastly, his very famous statement about pathology. Behind every suffering is a story. As a rule, this story has never been told. This story is the rock against which the man is shattered. And it is our job as therapists to find out that story. So not only behind every disorder, but behind every qualifying criteria of the disorder, there is a story. So the story of symptoms is very important to get the full story of the inner life of the person. In a way, we are story seekers. And I say, in most cases, we get the story. In some cases, we don't. On my YouTube channel, there is a video which is titled, Some Stories Can Never Be Told. But they constitute 10%. 90% of the times, there is a story. And if we are creative enough, focused enough, we get the story. And the story gives us the path of healing and also the path to do therapy. One more element before we get into the core of Jung. Jung brought in the transpersonal element in psychoanalysis. Now, what is transpersonal? Transpersonal means something which is not peculiar to the personal experience of the individual. Like Freud's unconscious is created out of the experience of the individual with the family. But the moment we bring in society, it becomes something beyond the personal experience. And that is what is called transpersonal. Beyond the personal experience. So let us say, we normally say that pathology is determined by bio, psycho, and socio elements. That there are biological elements, psychological elements related to the individual and the family, and there are social elements. All the three come together to create pathology. But usually we talk only of psycho, bio, and socio. We only pay lip service. We don't really bring them into operation. But some people have brought in socio. For example, Alfred Adler, he brought in society for the first time to say that economic class also is a determinant of pathology. That lower down you go, some pathologies you find more than in the higher classes. He brought in Marxism into psychoanalysis, or at least tried to do it. In recent times, Lacan brought in the idea of the big other. The big other meaning society, language, traditions, historical experience of the group where I am born, the political circumstances in which I am born. If somebody was born in Sri Lanka as a Tamil, when the LTT war was going on, he would have choice only of joining the Tamil Ilam or joining some other group or be with the government. Nobody could be neutral. Because all the groups said, you are either with us or against us. And there was violence all around. And when you grow up there in such social circumstances, your mind develops in a different way. So the socio is transpersonal. It has nothing to do with the genes of the person or with the family dynamics. It has to do with the larger collective situation in which you find yourself. And your family also finds itself. So socio is the first element of transpersonal. Jung gets into transpersonal in a very different type. He gets into transpersonal through the idea of collective unconscious. So the collective unconscious also is transpersonal idea. It is something common to the whole race, which is the heritage of humanity. And there is a million-year-old man living in all of us, which again is a transpersonal idea. But Jung brings in transpersonal into psychology, not through the social angle, like Alfred Adler and Lacan. He brings in transpersonal through the idea of the collective unconscious, which is a transpersonal idea. In Hindu spirituality, we have a lot of transpersonal ideas. Hindu spirituality is rich in transpersonal. The concept of karma, the concept of suprahuman forces and beings, the concept of reincarnation, these are all transpersonal ideas in different ways. And what is very interesting is Terence McKenna experimented with psychedelics. And in psychedelic experiences, when he tried to explore the unconscious, he could find encounter with some of the archetypal figures. And Stanislav Grof, who experimented first with psychedelics and then gave up psychedelics and went into a different kind of breathing called holotropic breathing, which we will say is an extreme form of pranayama. In that holotropic breathing, he said, we come in contact with archetypal figures. And both these experiments give some credence to the idea of collective unconscious and the archetypes, which we encounter only in some specific states. And Jung's genius was he could encounter this without holotropic breathing or psychedelics. Now, we are yet to prove empirically the idea of collective unconscious and the idea of archetypes, but those who are deeply exploring the unconscious in different ways, they do report subjective encounters with things which are very near to Jung's description of archetypes. And many people who take drugs, they also describe encounter with entities which are very near to the description of archetypes. So one more element before we get into Jung's model of the mind, that Jung brought in the transpersonal into psychoanalysis again. And Jung's theory essentially is a transpersonal theory. It is not an individual-centered theory. It is a transpersonal theory, although it has individual centricity. But the landscape in which Jung operates is a transpersonal landscape. So, as we said, to know any school of psychoanalysis, we have to know these 7 things related to that school. And let us go one by one into Jung's philosophy, Jung's model of the mind, and so on. So we get to know Jung's school. Any school in psychoanalysis you can understand in these 7 compartments. So let us go into the first compartment, philosophy. And I have done a comparative here, that if you take up each of the schools of psychoanalysis, what are the philosophical roots? What is the core philosophical question they deal with? How do they view the source of psychopathology? And what is the therapy focus? So if you go into Sigmund Freud, the philosophical roots are in materialism. The central philosophical question is, what unconscious forces govern our behavior? Source of pathology is repression and unresolved conflict. And therapy focus is insight into unconscious conflict and catharsis. If you go into Melanie Klein, you find something else. Wilfred Bion, something else. So we have done all the 3. Freud, Klein, Bion. And now we are into Jung. And in Jung, The philosophical roots are in holism, that everything is somehow conscious and connected. Idealism, that idealism both in the sense of rational idealism and in sense of ethics. Jung says we are in search of something sacred, and Freud tried to find the sacred in sexuality. But the core problem is last 250 years of modernity have stripped the sacred out of our lives and tried to bring in some hedonistic idea of pleasure, whether sexuality or possession of material things or buying a house or something. But really what we are deprived of is the sacred. And the search of the sacred is turning through a vicissitude into a search for the hedonistic pleasure. So there is an idealism in you and there is a spiritualism in you. So these are the philosophical roots. The philosophical question that is at the core is, what is the deeper purpose of psychic life? Jung is concerned more with the goal than with the origin. Freud is concerned more with the origin than with the goal. Of course, both are concerned with both, but relatively speaking. The source of pathology for Jung is alienation from the self and the symbolic life, the destruction of the mythical from our lives. We suffer from too much of reality, far more than too much of fantasy. Because modernity destroys the myth. It says, be rational. The myth is nothing more than a psychotic fantasy. But the myth is equally important for human life. Our poverty of myth is also one form of poverty. We talk of economic poverty. Similarly, we can have ethical poverty, spiritual poverty, artistic poverty, sensitivity poverty, and also the poverty of myth. One of the Hindi writers, Nirmal Verma, has written extensively upon this. The poverty of myth in our everyday life today, and how it alienates us from nature, tradition, and so on. And the therapy focus is individuation and self-realization. You can do this for what we are going to do after you. After you, we'll be doing Winnicott, Kohut, and Davanloo. I have done the same for it, but we'll discuss it later when it comes to it. But these are like a comparative table of philosophical roots of each school of psychoanalysis. The core question they deal with, the core cause of pathology they believe in, and the core focus of therapy. If you are teaching any class, I'll be glad if you can use these slides.
Thank you so much. Grateful.
So let us go into Jung's philosophy. The philosophical roots are in holism. That there is a consciousness in nature. There is design in nature. There is a connectedness in nature. The individual psyche is not free, disjointed from nature, but we are connected. It's one system interconnected. There is governance of nature by something in nature that governs the whole thing. And there is also a goal of nature. And there is some design in reality. That design gives rise to form, forces, beings, and the goal of the universe. And that in turn, in some way, is associated with the laws of nature. The laws of nature are not falling from nowhere, and they are not purposeless. It is not that some laws of nature suddenly activated from somewhere and started producing processes. It is one grand design in which there is a purpose, and towards the purpose are the laws. The self, the individual, the collective are connected. The collective unconscious is connected to our species past, and it's also connected in some way that we don't know to the whole of nature. And archetypes are elements through which the human psyche gets connected to the whole of totality. Similarly, the self is another element through which the human psyche is connected to the whole of totality. And human life has a purpose of individuation. It is not a purposeless existence. human existence is very much a purposeful existence. He is very clear. Jung does not say that we don't know if we have a goal or not. Jung says we definitely have a goal. We just have to find it out. The tree comes out of the seed, and the seed has complete blueprint of the tree. The tree has just to find out what the blueprint is. So Jung is not an existential philosopher who says, just go out with a blank slate and see what conclusion you reach. If you believe there is a goal of life, there is. If you don't believe, there is not. Jung is not that existential philosopher. Jung is a believer that there is definitely a goal of life. We just have to find our goal. And pathology is just one of the elements therapy has to deal with. Removal of pathology is not the goal of therapy. It is one of the secondary elements. The prime element is individuation and self-realization. So individuation is the process, and when the process completes, self-realization happens. So the therapy has to focus on individuation, and as a sidekick of individuation, the removal of symptoms has to happen. The removal of symptoms is not the center. It is secondary. It's a second goal. The first goal is individuation. Of course, both are goals. We are not saying we will not attend to symptoms, but attending to symptoms is secondary. Facilitating the person to individuate is primary. And on the path of individuation, as we proceed, the secondary component will be removal of symptoms. And the therapy is to incorporate these elements. This is the philosophy. Now come to the model of the mind. And this is Jung's model of the mind presented by Anthony Stevens. If you have anyone to read on Jung, read Anthony Stevens. He is one of the most grounded, scientifically well-informed, and very systematic Jungian thinker, far more systematic than Jung himself. Jung is the last person you should read on Jung. As I said, he is a man on the motorcycle. I call him a man on the motorcycle. He does not have the patience of Freud to be with a concept and then think it out in various ways. Have patience, do the hard, painful thinking work of detailing out the concepts, putting the boundaries to definition, directing it to a particular pathology, looking at non-clinical application of the concept. That kind of painful work Jung will not do. He will have a discovery, develop it for a year or two, and then move to a next discovery. So he is a serial discoverer, just as he is a serial offender when it comes to women. So when it comes to women, he is a serial offender. He sleeps around with most of his patients. By today's standards, he would be in jail. But he is also a serial discoverer, extremely creative person, who jumps from one great discovery to another. So I call him man on a motorcycle, who will stop at some place, have a cup of tea, take some rest, again start the motorcycle and go somewhere else. But he's not going to buy a house and live at some place for 3 years, conceptually speaking. That detailing painful work Freud could do, Jung would not. And Anthony Stevens has done that painful work of understanding Jung, reading Jung, understanding Jung, indexing him to the latest discoveries in science, reading anthropology, reading ethology, reading evolutionary science, and bring all of that together and make Jung as systematic as he can. And after discussion of this model, we also go into what Jung himself says and what some Jungians differ from this model and what is my take on it, the third model. But let us first start with the basics. Jung's model of the mind, as Anthony Stevens has put in, and this is one of the best to start with, there is something called self at the center. And self is the coordinator of the whole psyche. Jung does not define the self, but he says self has the goal of wholeness, of integration, of combining the two opposites and going beyond it. The anima and the animus have to integrate. The persona and the shadow have to integrate. The white and the black has to integrate. Aggression and pacifism has to integrate. And once these integrate, you transcend both of them and you take a third transcendental position. You are no longer trapped on the continuum. You are outside of the continuum and you can operate the continuum. And situation based, you can take a position on the continuum. So the self wants wholeness. The self wants integration of the opposites. The self wants transcendence. The self wants experiences. And the self also wants to do good to the society. So the self is the center that wants to develop through experiences of the psyche and through the psyche working on itself in the process of individuation and integration. In a way, the self is like what we would call in Hindu spirituality as the Jivatma. That the Jivatma takes the essence of all our experiences and develops itself. And it also wants to shed the karmic baggage so that the whole psyche can be free of the karmic load. The only difference is Jung does not go into the idea of reincarnation and evolution through reincarnation, which Hindu spirituality does. In Hindu spirituality, the self-equivalent will be Jivatma. It will undergo reincarnations. And every time it will have a new set of experiences, new set of growth, new set of integrations, new set of contributions to society. That Jung does not go in. But self is the coordinator of the psyche, and the goal of the self is wholeness or completeness, individuation. The individuation is the process of completeness, wholeness, and the end result is self-realization. That the self realizes itself, its goal of completeness, of wholeness. The self is surrounded by the collective unconscious, and the collective unconscious is transpersonal. It is not unique to the individual, it's unique to the species. The space of collective unconscious is populated by archetypes. And there is a difficulty here in Anthony Stevens' model and Jung's model both. That when you talk of the million-year-old man in us, and when you talk of transmission of human experience from one generation to the other, is it all only through archetypes, or is there something else in the collective unconscious? My belief is there should be something else. Apart from archetypes, there should be something else, which is the repository of human experience across generations. When we say 2 million year old man in us, that essence of that should be in the collective unconscious apart from the archetypes. But that is my idea. As Anthony Stevens and Jung say, they are not specified how the 2 million year old man lives in us, how experiences are transmitted in any form other than the archetypes. And even in archetypes, we are not clear how that intergenerational transmission takes place. We are only told about that all of us have this common heritage, and the outside society is a reflection of the inside. In the outside society, what do you find? You find a healer, you find a teacher, you find an old wise man, you find the hero, you find a magician, you find a child, you find a mother, you find a father. Jung says the society we find outside is not incidental, not accidental. It is as it is because it is a reflection of what is inside. We have the archetypes in our mind of the magician, the healer, the doctor, the teacher, and this is what gets created in the outside world. So the outside world, the society that we see is not incidental. It is the realization of the blueprint inside. Otherwise, society could have been in any other way. But we don't find society in any other way across all human generations. Even in the tribal societies, we find the same social roles. And it cannot be otherwise because of the nature of things. The nature of things is everything is so complex, you can only take one profession. It is the nature of things. And therefore, Jung says, what is inside becomes a society outside. The blueprint inside, the seed becomes the tree. The seed of the society is in all of us. And that goes on to become society. So just as human will is important in creating society, just as natural conditions are important, geography is important, astronomical accidents are important, famine and flood are important. Similarly, the inner blueprint also is important. All of this comes together to create that we see society around. It is not free of design. The society as we see is not incidental. There is a design component in it. And the design component comes from the archetypes that we have here. These archetypes realize themselves partially in everybody, but strongly in the one who has that archetype as the strongest. So if we all have a teacher archetype, but if I have teacher archetype to be very strong, then I will take up the teaching profession. And students will project that archetype onto me. And whatever is the content of that archetype will also come onto me as projection. So the students will not see me as I am, but as I am plus the projection of archetypes. So when we see to go to see a doctor, a healer, the healer archetype is projected onto the doctor. That is what makes him omnipotent. And that is what gives him the power that when he sits on the chair and says something, it means a huge thing to the patient. It can make the patient extremely happy and confident. It can terrorize the patient. It can break the patient. The power is not of the man, it is of the chair he sits and the projection the chair solicits. So we project omnipotence in a unique flavor, omnipotence in the flavor of the teacher, the great knowledgeable person. So we project it, but the archetype of the teacher is inside. Similarly, those who have a strong healer archetype will take up most likely, unless there is a compulsion of circumstances, the healing profession. Those who have hero archetype of a particular type, say the warrior archetype, they are likely to go to the army. The hero archetype, they will also either become leaders or actors or something of that sort. Please.
So when we talk about archetypes, what are the criterias which decides the activation of archetypes and in an individual? Because sometimes the governing archetype has many other components of other archetypes also. So those activation, deactivation, other than the life forces and situations, are they sequential in nature that this is how ideally the archetypes should move?
Correct. Very good question. So the activation and deactivation of archetypes partly depends on the program of life. It is age appropriate based. That when you are very young, the child archetype will be activated, and the child archetype in you will activate the mother archetype in the mother and the father archetype in the father. This is called evocation and constellation. Meaning, let us say the child is alone and the mother comes in front of him, and the mother archetype is active in the mother. Now the child finds himself where one archetype is active in front of him, and that is called constellation. That mother archetype is constellating around him, and that constellation of an active archetype evokes in him a corresponding archetype, which is the child archetype. And that archetype evokes in him all the thoughts, feelings, and behavioral patterns as appropriate to the child. So the cognitive component, the affective component, and the behavioral component of the child as a package is evoked. Once the child archetype is evoked, it is like the switch. Once the switch is active, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors appropriate to a child are activated in him, and he acts out all those patterns. So there is constellation and activation. So one way to evoke the archetype is from inside, that the self activates the archetype appropriate to age. When you are very small, it activates the child archetype. When you become a teenager, the self deactivates partly the child archetype, but activates more the prince archetype. The prince who wants to free himself from the octopus kind of mother who is holding him in 10 tentacles, and therefore the archetypic, the mythical story is that the prince goes on an expedition. He is sailing on a boat, and from below the water, an octopus comes up. He grips the prince, and the prince takes out the sword and one by one cuts all the hands of the octopus and moves ahead on the journey. And as he lands somewhere, he finds a beautiful woman, the princess. Now, this story, which is very common in literature across the world, is actually a story of the inner struggle. And therefore, it is common across the world because the inner struggle is common across the world. Literature reflects the psychic inner struggles. So, because we all have to become teenagers at some point, and we all have to break free from the mother, but it's not easy because the mother is holding us in 10 tentacles. And we want to break free from it and become an adult and find someone like the mother to overcome our own Oedipus complex. So the shackles of the mother, the shackles of the Oedipus are holding us and we want to break free. So in teen age, children want to break free from the mothers. They will tell you, don't come to drop me at school. I will go alone to the market. You will not be with me. People laugh at me. You still go with your mother. And they will also rebel against you as a mark of their freedom. So the mythical representation of this psychic stage is of the prince going on the journey. His boat is on the water. The water represents the complete unconscious. And from the unconscious, the tentacles, the mother emerges out as an octopus with tentacles, holds you, and you have to break free. And when you break free from the mother, you really start your journey to find a mother substitute, which is the princess, the prize that you get for your trials and tribulations and your courage as the hero and your strength as the hero. You prove your worth and you get the princess after that tribulation and that, how do I say, ordeal. Yeah, Paula, you were saying something.
Sir, in one of the readings, I came across that Jung has talked about these archetypes in a very neutral way, by which the article meant that it is the inner work which also activates, deactivates, or rather navigates the archetype. In a sense, a mother can be a loving, kind mother archetype and also a smothering one, or a hero can be a tyrant or a real one. So, the spectrum in the archetype itself, is it what is being done in the therapy space as inner work?
So setting right the archetypal expression is as important as activation and deactivation of the archetype. Because any archetype can go into something constructive or destructive. So ethics comes in. The archetypal activation, deactivation cannot be free of ethics.
So, like in Freud's concept, there was superego which would govern this kind of development. Did Jung provide with any of thing in his model which would govern these archetypes and what it is?
So there are some elements which govern activation and deactivation. One is the self from inside, which is activating and deactivating based upon age, number one, and two, based upon its own flavor and goal. That everyone's self wants a different kind of completeness. We all want completeness, but in a different way. So we all want to drink limbu sharbat, but the proportion of salt and sugar is different. So we all have our own ways of individuation and self-realization. The color and flavor is different. So based upon that, also the self activates and deactivates. For example, if your way of individuation involves being a teacher, then the teacher archetype will be activated for a much longer time than other archetypes. And if your archetype is that of a healer, then the healer archetype will be activated far longer than a teacher archetype or a warrior archetype. So the self activates based upon age and based upon its own plan for individuation. That is one activation, deactivation from the inside. Second activation, deactivation, as you said, control happens from the ego and the superego. In Jung's terms, the superego is the moral complex, the moral archetype. So Jung talks about the moral complex, which is equivalent of superego, and that also influences the activation, deactivation. The ego has to adjust to the environment. So based upon the environment, ego also gives a feedback for activation and deactivation. I am not going to activate my warrior archetype in the front of a police commissioner. Otherwise, he will activate some other archetypes in me. So based upon the environment and adjustment to environment also, the activation and deactivation takes place, which the ego does. And then there is the overwhelming force at times of the environment, which even if the ego does not want to do, it does. So ego can have a choice if the environment is mild. Then ego exercises more of itself and less of the environment in adaptation. But if the environment is overwhelming, then ego will have less of its own voice and more of transmission of environment. That also results in activation and deactivation.
That also means that the program of life is run by these archetypes.
Correct. And that also brings us key, if the environment is completely opposite to your program of life, you will just feel overwhelmed by the environment and you will feel you are not able to live out yourself, which is the story of many of us. That when we look inside what we are and we want to live it out, it's very different from what the environment will accept. And that is where the inner struggle, the inner frustration and alienation will come. That we are completely not the type environment wants us to be.
These archetype can also become a route map for dream interpretations.
Yes, because the moment you define a concept of archetype, you will have to say what elements in the dream are archetypal and what elements are from the personal unconscious. Because the moment you have this model of the mind, the moment you have this, sorry, Bhavna, you were saying something.
It becomes like a very handy tool to decipher the dream.
Correct, because dream analysis will always be function of the model of the mind and concepts. like pathogenesis, and like therapy. The moment you have this, when you do Jungian interpretation of dreams, obviously you will have something representing the self. So we'll come to it. Okay, how is self represented in dreams? How are archetypes represented in dreams? How is ego represented in dreams? All these elements will find their expression in dreams. And all these elements will play a role in pathogenesis. And all these elements will have to be factored in therapy. So we will see as we go along how each of them appears in dreams. How can we separate that this symbol of the dream, this element of the dream is coming from the personal unconscious and this element is coming from the collective unconscious? What guidelines has Jung given us? We'll come to it in a moment. We'll go in details of each of the elements. Self, ego, each of these elements. Surrounding the collective unconscious is the personal unconscious, which is like Freud's unconscious, where all the repressed material, traumas, anxieties, childhood difficulties, all of them are stored. Long forgotten memories also are stored. This is very much like Freud's unconscious. Now, one very important element is Jung does not provide any storage space in the collective unconscious. Storage is completely in the personal unconscious. So in this city of the collective unconscious, nobody can have a warehouse. Which is, again, I differ from it. I believe there should be some storage space in the collective unconscious where intergenerational storage can happen. Yes.
Can we use an analogy of DNA as a collective unconscious?
DNA will give rise to collective unconscious. You are right. The collective unconscious will have a link to DNA. Otherwise, how can it be passed? Because Jung is very clear that across different parts of the human world, say there is a tribe in Amazon and we are living in India. If something has to go from us to them, it can go only in two ways. Either there is cultural diffusion, that somebody from them has come to us and taken back something from us, or somebody from us has gone to them. So what is called the spread of ideas, technologies and everything, culture, religion, everything, by cultural diffusion. And second is by a genetic route. That in some way our genes are connected and in some way there is a constancy across the tribes of the collective unconscious. It is species specific. Now, if you put a question, will their collective unconscious evolve at the same rate as our collective unconscious? We don't know. Will our evolution be passed on to them through some mystical process? We don't know. So these are the difficulties of this concept. But the concept is that there is a minimum common program which is genetic to our race, and that everyone has and everyone always had right from the beginning of the race. So there is this personal unconscious, which is very much like Freudian. Yes, please.
Sir, I don't know if they are relevant. I just had a doubt that if we could compare the childhoods of Freud and Jung, it might be interesting because their temperaments were so opposite of each other during their career. The commitment that they gave and creativity that they showed and the discipline and organization that they had are the points that come to my mind. And the other point was a relatively, I don't know why I have to always make it sound a little less important. I remembered the novel called Sibyl by Schreiber, Flora Rita Schreiber, and dissociative identity disorder and multiple personalities becoming and unbecoming and then coming together and all those. So are they better explained by a Freudian school or by a Jungian school or psychodynamic in general, generic sense? How do we look at it?
Okay. To be honest, they are adequately explained by nobody.
Explained by?
Nobody.
Oh, I see.
Both theories fall short. When it comes to multiple identity disorders, we get explanations, but we don't feel satisfied. So every school has an explanation, but we don't feel satisfied by it. Relatively speaking, Jung has a better explanation. In the sense, Freud will only talk about the vertical split in the psyche. So normally there's horizontal split, conscious and unconscious. Now there is a second split in the conscious also, that there are two different conscious living, two different personalities. So there is a vertical split in the conscious and the unconscious both. It's interesting to note that the vertical split is not only in the conscious, also in the unconscious.
Yes.
Because there is one documented case of a multiple identity disorder where one personality was diabetic and one was not.
Yeah.
So the split is across. It's not only in the psyche, but it can go deep down into the body. So Freud has this to say, and his ideas would be based upon trauma, repression, and living out different desires, incompatible with each other. His idea will be that of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now,
But so in literal terms, Jung would have more of vocabulary to support these splits using personas and archetypes
yes,
coexisting with the and the collective archetypes.
correct,
So, in the explanation part, he holds more of
Diversity.
components,
correct,
components to relate to.
correct. So when we look at any idea, we look at the explanatory power of the idea, we look at the predictive power of the idea, and we look at the healing power of the idea. So if we test ideas of both the schools on the explanatory part, Jung has a better explanatory power of the idea. Now, if we go into the predictive part of the predictive power of the idea, neither of them is, because neither is very deep in terms of explaining pathology, which is very satisfactory. And when we go into the healing part of it, Jung has slight edge over Freud. So in psychoanalysis, when we look at an idea, we have an explanatory power, we have a predictive power, and we have a healing power of the idea. So on predictive power, both of them fail. In explanatory power, Jung is relatively better. In healing part, Jung is relatively better. So both are unsatisfactory, but relatively speaking, Jung is slightly better.
Sir, what if we use both the approaches towards the idea, where each archetype has its or whatever the persona or the components, and then we have the Jungian uh, explanation, and we apply each Freudian concept on each to understand the multiple personality disorder. Because then the understanding is way more gullible.
Correct.
One appears to be very fantasy based, other appears to be very structured, and when we combine, like for few of the cases I had done this first, use the archetype and the persona version of that, and from there on then I applied on each version of it Freudian concepts, and there was much of clarity and much healing took place.
Correct. But I will not interpret the slip you made.
What was that?
Sorry?
You said gullible instead of palatable. So let us not
You
go into
got
the.
me.
I will
You
not go into
got
the
me.
analysis of it. But your idea is correct that if we bring to bear both, we are in a much better position. And if we can get in a few more schools, that adds to our basket of tools. So you are right. The more schools we can synthesize, better it is. So then this is the personal unconscious. Now, then you have the conscious. And then you have the ego in the conscious. And very important for Jung is the ego self-axis. How much ego listens to the self in deciding how to live. If the ego is completely under the influence of the environment which is here, because outside of the psyche is the environment. If the ego listens to the environment here, but does not listen to the self inside, then this axis becomes weak and you live a life which is not rooted inside. It is very plastic, very synthetic, completely based upon the trends and the fads outside. And this is what results in alienation. So strengthening of the ego-self axis is very important to remain rooted, wholesome, authentic, true to oneself, and not get carried away by the winds of environment. And that to Jung is very important, to live out our true subjective reality and not be washed away by the winds of the environment. And that means the ego has to have this axis very, very strong. Okay. So this is how Anthony Stevens puts it. Now, some people, Jung had at some point written that the self is not only inside but also outside, which means you will need one more layer here of self, which is like this. That you have the self, collective unconscious, personal unconscious, conscious, and again a layer of self. So if you call this S1, this is S2, and then environment outside. So Jung has written somewhere that the self is not only inside, but it also is or around the circumference. So that will lead to this idea. But this idea has a lot of problems, and it's better to use Anthony Stevens' model. Why? The problems here are, what will happen to the ego-self axis? Will we have two axes, one inside and one outside? So then we will have ego-self axis that connects ego to the self inside and ego to the self outside. So there will be two axes. Second problem, if the self is directly in touch with the environment, what is the function of ego? Is the ego function still the same, or is it part of the function is taken away by the self?
Yeah. Of that of a catalyst?
Yeah, so the function of the ego then will have to be redefined. That Jung does not do. Even when he says the self is in the circumference, then what happens to the functions of the ego? Do they remain the same, or is there a change? Third problem, when the self of the one comes in the touch with the self of the other, what will happen? So we normally know ego-ego interaction, but what happens to the self-self interaction? There is no light on that. Another problem is this self in touch with totality of environment outside? Because when Jung was theorizing this kind of things, he was also thinking about the individual being linked to totality, because he was also working with one of the quantum mechanics person, Wolfgang Pauli. We have learned Pauli's principle in science, and both of them wanted to see if you can find archetypes not only in the human mind but outside in nature. So just as there are psychological archetypes, can we have physical archetypes, some deep-seated patterns which are governing the rest of matter? And then when we have psychological archetypes and the physical archetypes, can there be a more elemental entity of which both of them are expressions? And that entity is what Jung was calling unus mundus. Right? One world, one grand convergence, one grand theory of everything. And the root of that theory will be unus mundus, the source of everything, of which matter, life, mind, human life, all of that is but one specific variation out of millions of variations. So is there some kind of that grand unity, a grand design from which everything else emerges, from which everything else is governed, and from which everything else gets its goal, and all these goals come together for a grand goal? That kind of a theory of everything kind of thinking was going on. So we don't know if this second self S2 is also in touch with the fundamentals of the world at large. So we don't know how this will work out and what advantages we have. Now, one important point we have to make it. Let us say, even if the self wants to be in touch with the environment without the intermediate covers of collective and unconscious, personal, and the ego, you can do it differently. And the important point here is something very important. Let me wait for a moment. I would not like Dr. Paralekar to miss this because yeah.
Yes.
So I was saying that the important point I was about to make is that you don't have to be geographically present to be operationally present. Like, suppose the self wants to be directly in touch with the environment. You don't need a self outside. You can just create openings inside. Like, if you say that the layer of collective unconscious is not a solid layer, but there are gaps through which the self can be in touch with the personal unconscious. And the personal unconscious also has gaps through which the self can directly be in touch with the conscious. And the conscious has gaps through which the self is directly in touch with the environment. So you can create those open spaces. And then to be operationally present, you don't have to be geographically present. Like, to directly be in touch with the environment, you can have those open spaces. You don't need to put a second layer outside. So this is where my point comes, that to be operationally present, you don't have to be geographically present. You can just have openings through which you can get across a layer, which means the self can directly interact with something in the personal unconscious without going through any archetype of the collective unconscious.
But this concept can bring in a possibility that there would be certain self who would have more of permeability,
correct,
and there would be certain self which would have less of permeability.
true. And there will be some selves which will make more use of collective unconscious than the personal, and some self which will make more use of the personal unconscious than the
Personal.
collective.
Right. Right.
So when I develop my, yes, sorry.
The criticism could be the self has porous boundaries.
No, the
Hmm.
collective unconscious and the personal unconscious have porous boundaries.
Okay.
That is one. Second, it's a very good question you have put, because then the question will come once you have these open spaces. The question will be, is the traffic one way or two way? And if it is two way, then are there boundaries and freedom to reject, or is it a two-way traffic which is inevitable? We can have a two-way traffic where still there can be boundaries which select entry or non-entry. You can have a visa system.
Or the receptors on the cell,
Correct.
which can be very
So
specific.
we can have open spaces with two-way traffic where there is a freedom to accept or reject, like all cell boundaries here. So we can have a open spaces system where you don't have to be geographically present to be operationally present. And you can have a multi-directional traffic with strength in each component of the psyche to accept or reject. And obviously there will be situations where you don't want to accept, but the force is so much it does intrudes in, which will be more like psychotic conditions.
And like in collective consciousness, it can be not a personal thing, but yeah, from the environment, there can be big blows which can still alter it.
Correct. Because the self taking over everything also can be psychotic. Because then all reality adaptation is lost. You're just trying to be yourself, and God knows what you are yourself.
I'm reminded of Trump.
Yes. His problem is he actually is trying to become what he is. There are no screening. There is no filtration.
So it's the other way. The whole environment is being affected, and everyone's self and collective consciousness is being affected because of the decisions.
Because if you bring in Freud here, then the idea will be, what is the nature of the self? Is it id heavy? Is it ego heavy? Is it super ego heavy? And God forbid if somebody's self is id heavy and he wants to realize himself without any filtrations, or we have to put a definitional condition that the self by its own nature is good.
But
If
like
we
if you
put
see
that
Hitler's
axiomatic
self,
condition, it's a different thing.
if we see Hitler's self,
Yeah. So then it brings us to the discussion on the various nature the self can take. That is self always the good part of us, or is it free to be anything? And if it's free to be anything, then the self cannot be allowed to bypass the moral complex. And
also in that case, like sir, in case of a narcissist, uh, the self would not like to accommodate, reject, and accept, rather do it to the outer environment, right? It's the expansion of self in a pathological way. So this model can deal very well with the personality disorders.
so that will be the uh, pathogenesis of narcissistic personality disorder in Jung's language. That the self overwhelms the ego. When the self overwhelms the ego, you are too full of the self. And all these problems come up because the definitions are not watertight.
And the projection of self onto the others and disregarding the collective consciousness in the Jungian way.
So I would say that instead of going by this Jungian model, where the self is both in the center and the circumference, it is better to use Anthony Stevens' model, where it is at the center. And if you still want to use this model, in Anthony Stevens' model, create open spaces. This is a much better synthesis of the two.
All these years, I thought this model just depicts the layers. It is nothing to do with the compactness of it. Today, I just came to know that it has to do with it, and the other person has shown the right way. Thank you, sir. Thank you for that.
So now let us go in, understand each of the elements of the model. What are the elements of the model? Self, collective unconscious, archetypes, personal unconscious, conscious, ego self axis. Let us go into each of them. First, self. Please feel free to use this presentation for teaching. I have no problem. How does Jung define it? The totality of the psyche, both the conscious and the unconscious, and the organizing center of the whole personality. Now, this is a confusing definition. If you say organizing center of the whole personality, easy to understand. But if you say totality of the psyche, which means everything is then self, it becomes like Kohut's definition. Near to it, not exactly. It is better to take. Now let me go ahead and then come to what we should take rather than agree with Jung here. Second, the self contains the ego. Ego does not contain the self. This is Jung, not me. I would never put it this way. It's very loose, very amorphous. Everything consumes everything else. There are no clear definitions. But anyway, since
And
I'm
sir, how
teaching,
would you vary here? I would like to know that because
yeah. So
resonate with this self contains the ego.
yeah, I would say the self is more important than the ego, rather than saying it contains the ego.
But contains doesn't take away the parameters which you are talking about.
So if it is geographical containment or operational containment, then there is a problem.
It is I felt it is a container as in the geographical or physical containment of the ego.
So then we will come to the second model of Jung, where there is a self outside and everything is inside. because these two statements are actually related to the second model, not Anthony Stevens' model, not the open space model, but the second model.
Okay.
These two statements go with that kind of thought. So the simpler way would be that self is the organizing center of the personality. And the goal of self is wholeness. And towards it, the entire psyche works.
So, but isn't that an ideal self which you're talking about?
Huh,
That is the sorted self.
correct. So I'm not saying that
All
the
the
self,
selves are like that.
we are able to live out according to. No, because our own ego rejects many of the things that self wants it to.
Mm. Mm.
And that is where, again, the independence of the ego comes. Because the moment you say self contains the ego, the independence of ego is in question.
So, but self can be the sorter of ego, and ego can also be a sorter of self. That is how the psyche is being governed,
So,
pathologically or healthy way.
so if there is clear division of labor, it's much simpler. That the self coordinates and gives a purpose to the whole system. It coordinates age appropriate, it coordinates environment appropriate to some degree. But how much from the self to listen and how much to listen to the environment, that reality adaptation is with the ego. And ego has an autonomy to say no to the self.
Mm.
That is
Mm.
where, according to Jung, neurosis comes. Now, these
Mm.
two statements directly contradict Jung's own pathogenesis of neurosis.
Okay. Okay.
So when Jung says that when we don't listen to the psyche and listen too much to the environment, we get into alienation and neurosis.
Mm. 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 Mm.
We have broken the ego self axis. We have stopped listening to the ego. Sorry, the ego has stopped listening to the self.
Self.
Now, if the ego is contained completely in the self and the self is everything, if it is the most powerful element which contains everything, then the ego can't dare to not listen to the self. So then there would be no problem, never a question of a weak ego self exists because ego is under the control of the self. So if the ego self axis is a variable and there is a possibility of an alienation and ego has an autonomy, then the self cannot completely contain the ego. That is one way to look at it. But this is, Jung says these are two statements, but I would say simpler way is to say that the self is the organizing self of the personality and the self is more important and more powerful than the ego.
Jungian self.
Yes.
Is it, sir, like Freud, early Freud, later Freud, Jung, early Jung, later Jung?
That is
Because
true. But we also have the clear Jung and the confused Jung. The early Jung seems to be more clear Jung. The late Jung seems to be more confused Jung.
two complex things have come later.
Correct. He brought in too many things and he was not able to sort out. You are dealing with such a multifactorial theory that you don't have clear axiomatic definitions, clear boundaries of where the power of one begins and the function of second starts.
And many of the components sound very abstract. They're in their own explanation, not in touch and continuation with others.
Correct. And therefore, I always request go by Anthony Stevens. He's much clearer presentation of you, much better than Jung himself.
Sorted
As
Jung.
he understood Jung better than himself.
Correct.
And as the Jung could be classified as earlier Jung, Swiss Jung, and later Jung, American Jung.
Right. So I have put the first two statements because I did not want to teach Jung to Jung, but simpler way is that self can be taken as the center of the coordinator of the personality and one who gives purpose to the personality, and one is more important than the ego. But the ego has autonomy of its own. It can say no to the self. Now, what is the desire of the self? The desire of the self is wholeness, balance, integration, and completeness. These are very important in Jungian theory. Balance, integration, and completeness. Like a woman wants to be a mother, a lover, a healer, a teacher, everything. She does not want to be any one thing. She wants to be everything. That is the idea of completeness. And when she is able to do that, she feels more complete. Similarly, a healer is also a father, also a citizen of a country. He also has poetic interests. So he has to be all of it to be complete. So he should be able to divert his mental energy, focus, and time to all these pursuits for completeness. So Jung is not looking at a doctor who just keeps thinking about medicine all his life. He is also a citizen of the country. He also has an artistic interest. He also has a spiritual interest and all of it. So life demands attention. And it's a heterogeneous unconscious we are looking at. So completeness of all the parts of us, and this may vary. At present, you may have interest in 4 things, and tomorrow you may have an interest in other 4 things. So we are not talking of the fad of the day. We are not talking about the fashion cycles, but over a long period of time, interests can change. That in your journey, that in your journey, you were to dedicate 4 years to poetry and then 2 years to singing, and you do it. So completeness is very important, and self desires completeness. The self also desires integration, which is integration of the opposites, masculine and the feminine. The aggressive part of the us and peaceful part of us. The loving part of us and the renunciation part of us. We want to be attached and we also want renunciation. We want to be in the thick of things and we also want freedom. So much of the psychic struggle is the struggle of integration of the opposites. That we have opposites
Not
in
of
us.
anima and animus.
Anima and animus, the masculine and the feminine.
Are they the same?
No, they are opposites and we have to integrate.
No. Anima, animus, and masculine and feminine, are these two same or similar?
They are used synonymously.
But not exactly. They're not same. Are they?
One way to look at it is to say that the masculine part in us is animus and the feminine part of us is anima. And the way they come up in dreams are different. So they come up in the form of masculine and feminine symbols. But if you philosophically look into it, then masculinity and femininity, when you go into yin and yang, or Shiva and Shakti, they go beyond the human being. Like the river is deemed to be feminine and the mountain is deemed to be masculine. Now there's no human being there. We have taken the concepts out of the human mind, out of the human race on a much wider scale.
The archetype you mentioned earlier, beyond non-living things also have the archetypes.
Correct. And if you go even more philosophic, you say dynamism is feminine and stability is masculine.
Oh, I thought it's the other way.
I mean, that's what you see in the world, but philosophically you look at it. So when you talk of stability and dynamism, you are even out of specific forms of nature. You are talking at a much generic physical level.
Elemental mostly.
Elemental. Then if you go at the root of it, then inertia is masculine and motion is feminine.
That is Shiva and Shakti concept. Nothingness and action.
So then at a philosophical level, inertia and dynamism become anima and animus. Sorry, animus and anima. And at an even deeper philosophical level, you have being and manifestation. So there is a being, a stable layer of existence which does not want to manifest. and there is a manifestation. Then the entire manifestation becomes feminine, and the stable being which does not want any becoming, right? Any process, any event to happen, it just is blissful in itself, complete in itself. That becomes the Purusha. So,
Wow, what a discussion.
That's what I was going to ask. But are they exactly, again, similar to Prakriti and Purusha? Because
yeah, Prakriti and Purusha, yes. But then what happens is that the moment you talk about, go deeper into spirituality, and you talk about the Avyakt and the Vyakt, then Avyakt will be full of animus and the Vyakt will be full of this.
Anima.
They will become properties. Feminine and masculine will become properties of something which is very philosophically elemental. Like the unmanifest will have a property of stability, infinite completeness. And that which manifests will have property of flow, of femininity. So that the masculine and feminine become properties of some entity defined even more elementally in philosophy. So they become properties or they become entities which are motivational in the human psyche. Depends on how you use the concepts, but coming to our discussion, the self desires wholeness. And how does the wholeness come? By balance, integration, and completeness. Balance means you balance all the opposites. And in integration, of course, there is balance. But integration is a deeper concept. You can have a mechanical balance or you can have a real transformative integration. Like balance would be, Jung says, too much on one side leads to too much on the other. Meaning, if the conscious mind of a man deals only with masculinity, his dream life will be full of feminine secrets. Because too much on one side will lead to too much on the other. Too much in the conscious life will lead to too much in the unconscious life. What is abdicated by the conscious will go into the unconscious.
Is it a compensatory act or is it
It's a compensatory. For Jung, compensation is a very important concept. And the idea is balance, and balance comes from homeostasis. So the core idea is there is homeostasis in the mind, which another word for it is balance. And if the balance goes off track, there is a compensatory activity.
Sir, you also used certain levels for these anima animus, some stages. So
Yes.
are they desired and sequential in nature? What primitive, romantic for anima animus he has used, spiritual and integrated. These four versions levels he had talked about.
Correct. Oh, that's true
So
for all archetypes. All archetypes can operate at different levels.
they're sequential in nature.
In terms of developmental growth, yes, but not chronologically sequential. You may have in some person's life something coming before the other thing, individual combinations. But the moment you get into the manifestations of all archetypes, they can be in different colors and flavors and different levels of evolution.
So did he talk something like in the stages of like Freud, we had the word fixation or regression kind of things. In these stages of anima animus, is there any fixation where the person is stuck in a particular stage
There is.
and not moving ahead?
There is.
Did he use any term for that?
The archetype which should be deactivated remains active when it is not age appropriate. Like somebody is childish even in the adult age.
Not of the archetype. I'm talking about the anima and animus.
There can be too much of flooding of the psyche by either of them. Say, for example, there is a warrior archetype. The warrior archetype is hyperactive and the person keeps fighting with everyone. Now, the warrior archetype has a huge amount of animus in it. So the animus has to be reduced if that person has to use warrior archetype appropriately. and not keep fighting with everyone. That's
But many times people have that animus, which may be integrated animus for like the great warriors which existed in history. They have very integrated animus, which was there was a lot of wisdom and they never projected onto others. They could contain and integration had taken place for them.
So those are the ones we worship, like Rama and Krishna,
Right.
who are able to integrate this kind of things. So Rama is as hero, as animus as you can think about. But yet there was
Because
a
then
very well integrated femininity side, though not in expression. Like he was not a poet, he would not dance, he would not play the flute. So in Krishna, we see far more active integration of
integration.
anima than in Rama. Yeah,
Also, does that mean a person whose anima and animus has integrated would, since the projection is no more outside, it is integrated in self, they won't be looking it on for others. So they might go celibate or they will not get married because they feel complete.
correct.
Is a possibility.
That's the ideal.
It happens many times. For example, there are individuals who have given their life to sciences or particular art forms. Their anima and animus is still not projected onto another human being, but on something which has that kind of a quality. Somebody being a maestro of music and then
So there are two possibilities here. One is, see, whenever you have exclusive devotion to something, it can happen either because somebody has completely sorted out oneself, and it is the voice of the self to do so what he is doing, or the other parts have been repressed in some way.
Mhm.
Then also you can
So
have
there we can, that is where we can, suppose such people come for therapy. That is where we can easily see whether it is for which stage of the animus is at work. And from there we can understand whether it is a transformative integration or it is a disguised integration.
agreed. And the rule of thumb is it's very rare to have transformative integration done.
True. But that's the goal of the therapy.
So as a rule, we go by the rule of thumb that most individuals around us, including us, have not achieved transformation. And there will be few who are the exceptions. But it's quite possible that one may find somebody where the counter question can be, why will he come for therapy? That would be a counter question. And maybe some land up because of a Socratic motivation to know something. Who knows? Yes, sir, you're asking something.
Sir, this is completely different. I have a personal difficulty. I received a phone call just now, and one of my relatives and a senior, he's serious and admitted to the hospital. So I'm not sure if I'll be able to return. I will have to leave now, and first of all, I will talk on phone and decide. If it gets resolved in 15 minutes, I'll be back. If we can coincide our break, I'm sorry.
Yeah, please, please. So let us take a tea break and meet after 10 minutes.
Sir, thank you. Thank you, sir. Please come. It's okay. I'll speak later. No problem.
So we took up the first element in the model of the mind, the self. So we said self is the organizing center of the personality. Self is more important than the ego. The goal of self is wholeness, which is reconstructed into three things: balance, integration, completion. So what is the difference between two words which are used in Jungian parlance? Individuation and self-realization. Individuation is the process, self-realization is the goal of wholeness. So at the end of individuation, one realizes wholeness. And what we do in therapy is individuation. And when the wholeness is achieved, the goal of therapy is achieved. The self is an archetype of wholeness. That the self at the center can also be thought of as an archetype of wholeness. And it appears in dreams, mythology, art, and psychosis. The self appears in all these psychological areas: dreams, mythology, art, and psychosis. How does it appear? It appears in mandalas, circles, sacred centers, divine child figures which are evolving. That the divine child is evolving into divine adults, or a square gets converted into a circle. A half sphere gets completed into a full sphere. A triangle becomes a square, and the square becomes a circle. So these are all symbolic manifestations of completion, of wholeness, like the mandalas, in which the square mandala usually over a period of time becomes circular. So if you see the mandala drawings, you will see squares and circles. And as time proceeds, circles will increase and the squares will reduce. So these are like unconscious figures that we scribble on paper when we have nothing to do. And many of them resemble mandalas. In fact, as a child, I often used to scribble, and what I used to scribble unknowingly, later on I realized it was very close to some of the yantras. So these yantras and the mandalas, they are coming from something embedded naturally in us. Even without teaching, it comes out. It can come in the form of old wise men. It can come that finally you have reached that stage in the form of kings and queens, or in the form of union of opposites. These are very typical manifestations of the self in dream, mythology, art, and psychosis. So when these things come up in dreams, we should start thinking about the self. That in the dream, let us say, a rabbit and a tiger, they are coming together to create a cow. So now we are looking at union of the opposite. Extreme aggression and extreme peace coming together to create something different than both of them. The opposite synthesize into a third possibility. It's a transcendence. So those are self images in dreams. Pathology occurs when the ego goes too far from the self, which means ego has autonomy to go too far from the self, which means ego cannot be contained by the self. Again, the same point. Jung also talks about health indirectly in equilibrium terms. That when there is balance, homeostasis, equilibrium, health is ensured. And that means a balance of ego-self exists. So this is the first element, self, of the mind. Any questions on the self? Second element of the model of the mind is the collective unconscious. We'll one by one take up all the elements. Collective unconscious as a concept is a transpersonal concept. It contains the archetypes. Archetypes are predispositions, not final points. The transmission is potential from one generation to the other, not concrete. But what we see now is something very different. What we see now in terms of mice experiments and butterfly experiments, and you can see both of them on YouTube. Both of them are experiments where there is an intergenerational transmission of trauma. And this is not just in potential, it's near concrete transmission of trauma. But Jung talked not in these terms, but he talked in terms of the potential is transformed, the transmitted, not the concrete. Jung also says, in evolution, the heritage of mankind is in us. the million-year-old man is in us, he does not say how it is transmitted. It is in the collective unconscious. But is it only through archetypes? If through archetypes, then how? For example, if the Hindus have suffered the invasion, the jihadi invasions for such a long time, will it get transferred through genes? Will that transmission appear in archetypes? If not in archetypes, what other part of collective unconscious? So those kind of specifics we don't have. Jung is very clear that the storage of material is in the personal unconscious. In collective unconscious, we only have predispositions. How collective unconscious participates in evolution, we are told it participates, but how we don't know. You are saying something.
So this is very similar, that the tendency to get schizophrenia is inherited, but not the actual schizophrenia.
Correct.
So it is the diathesis that is heritable,
True.
but not the actual disease. But apart from the genes, they also float the concept called as memes in the social culture. For example, Alvin Toffler or these new people, they say that memes get transmitted across generations. So are they just the efforts to give some explanation, or that could be regarded as having some credence?
One thing which is happening is that the same thing is being rediscovered in very different contexts.
Mhm.
So that is something incidental.
Mhm.
That's one part. Second part has to do with that people have taken ideas from here and tried to polish it in some way and refine it and present.
Yeah.
Third is a deeply political question, because if the full-blown memories are being transmitted, then we are talking of an intergenerational revenge. That's a deeply political question. The fourth element is that what we see in the human system normally is that predispositions are transmitted, not the real final fully manufactured product.
Yes.
One other point comes in here is of genetics and epigenetics. That there is a whole area of epigenetics which tells you that by doing certain things in your diet and lifestyle, you can prevent the expression of certain genes. That it is not a foregone conclusion, it is a predisposition. It's not necessary that they will express. So there is a tendency to schizophrenia, but everything goes okay, the person may not have schizophrenia.
Exactly.
So that is the whole idea of epigenetics. And contrary to that idea are the mice and butterfly experiments. So we don't know how the synthesis of the two will happen in future, where we will have some qualifying conditions, probably, that if ABC happens, then it is destined, like in mice and butterfly. But if DEF happens, then there is a predisposition but not destination, or not destined. The destination is not destined, let us say.
Yes.
So, and the predisposition being transferred, it does not also seems logical, because if one generation does not teach its experience to the next, how is the evolutionary cause advanced? So one generation teaching to the next is a very normal thing to happen. And it will be transmitted in two ways. One is through books, technology, schooling system, educational system, and so on. Second, by the sheer machines that you create, tools that you create. And third will be genetic. Now, as far as I personally believe, there will be some transmission through genes of predispositions, of certain fears, like what you find in mice and butterfly, but may not be as concrete as that.
There was one teacher who taught us zoology way back, and he said, uh, rather than Darwin, you should also pay attention to Lamarck. And Lamarck
Exactly,
said that
exactly.
inherited characters acquired characters can be transmitted. That was
Absolutely.
Lamarck.
So Lamarck was very correct in many ways. People are afraid of use of Lamarck for racism.
Use of?
Lamarck's theory for racism.
Oh, yeah.
That is why he is not so studied. Otherwise, scientifically, there's nothing wrong in it. Just as in eugenics, there's nothing wrong scientifically. That one should not produce the race by default. One should design the race. And when it comes to the cattle, we do it very diligently.
Exactly.
When it comes to agriculture, we do it very diligently. But when it comes to our own production, we don't want to use science. So we produce agriculture and cattle far more scientifically than we produce ourselves. So what is the genesis of the collective unconscious? Jung got his ideas from many sources. One was the core idea of design in nature. Second was mythology. How can you have the same mythology, same literature all over the world, across people who have never met each other? Which means there's something inherent in us which gives rise to those ideas. Then dreams of the tribal people which are noted by anthropologists are often quite similar to those of psychotic patients in the city environment. And they have never met each other. The schizophrenic in the city has never read anything on anthropology. And yet the dreams are similar. So Jung feels that while cultural diffusion and genetic transmission both are at work, genetic transmission definitely is at work. It is not only cultural diffusion. So he's not denying cultural diffusion. He's only adding that genetic transmission also is one road to it. And that is the road of creating of collective unconscious. So this is the second element of the model of the mind. Third element is archetypes. It's a long element. I think we can stop for the day and take it up next time because archetypes will take a long time.
Yes.
And once we are through with the elements of the mind, we can go into the functioning and pathology. And then we go into, for example, that if self is imbalanced, what disorders it will lead to? If shadow is imbalanced, what DSM disorders will lead? So you can have all the Jungian concepts here and all the DSM-5 disorders. And which is the archetypal imbalance here? So these are the archetypes, and if something goes wrong, what DSM disorders result out of it, partly or fully. So I have made a list of all the major archetypes and the disorders. So slowly we'll get to that because this is the final station we have to come to, that what are the DSM disorders caused by each of these elements or concepts and how do you heal them in theory. Ultimately we'll come to DSM disorders and their healing, but till then we have to clear up some ground.
Yes.
So we have done two elements today of the model of the mind, self and the collective unconscious. In the collective unconscious are the archetypes. And in my view, there should also be something else which is the storage of intergenerational transmission, but Jung does not say anything about it. Anyway, we will start with archetypes next time.
But there was something also like collective conscious that was mentioned today? Or no?
The collective unconscious.
No, conscious.
No.
Nobody said anything like that in the session. Okay.
Because the collective consciousness is found in some animals very low in the evolution. Like some people say that ants have a collective way of it. But whether they are conscious about it or it is completely unconscious, we don't know. But there is definitely a collective consciousness. Whether that collective consciousness is operating out of the conscious part of the mind or the unconscious part of the mind. But one thing we can say that the collective consciousness is there and people more think of themselves as a part of the group rather than individuals. And this we can see in some countries also in the world. That in some countries like China, Japan, and Germany, for a long time, people used to think of themselves more as elements of the group than as individuals, which of course is changing now.
Or is it?
Good question. Like in Indian villages, many times people think of themselves more as a part of the caste or the community rather than an individual. Like two people fighting in Rajasthan in villages, very few will say X fought with Y. They will say person from caste X fought with person of caste Y. The collective consciousness triumphs over the individual.
I understand.
So let's do archetypes next time.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much.